The lights rise, the crowd roars, and then a hush you can almost touch. She steps into the spotlight like she always did, wrapped in brilliance and expectation. For a moment, the world believes it will hear that miracle again, notes that once soared so clean they felt like daylight. But tonight, the vibrato flickers, lines blur, and the woman behind the voice looks as if she's carrying something too heavy for the stage. This is Whitney Houston, as the public rarely understood her, an icon built on impossible standards, a daughter of gospel, a global star who turned stadiums into sanctuaries. She was trained to deliver perfection, and perfection became the cage. Off stage, the glare didn't fade. It followed her into kitchens, studios, back seats, hotel corridors. Whispers multiplied into headlines. Applause became a countdown. At the center of the storm stood the man she loved, Bobby Brown. Magnetic, talented, volatile, and to many irresistible trouble. Their chemistry was undeniable, their orbit unstable. What began as a love story turned into gravity. Parties blurred into patterns. Late nights became long seasons. Affection morphed into arguments, then into a cycle of apologies and promises to start again tomorrow. Cameras caught smiles, microphones didn't catch what came after. This isn't the tale the poster sold. It is a slow eclipse. Fame, pressure, rumors, substances. A relationship that burned brighter than either could hold. Friends recall warnings. Teams tried interventions. Family prayed. Yet the myth of control, "we've got this," is the easiest to believe when the world keeps cheering. So we ask the only honest question: what really happened behind the perfect photos? How did a love that felt like a refuge become the road to ruin, pulling one of the greatest voices of our time away from the music that made her immortal? To find the answer, we'll peel back the glossy covers, follow the timelines, listen to the people who were there, and trace the moments when choice turned into momentum. The stage remembers the sound, but the truth behind it is much darker. Before the headlines, before the whispers of decline, Whitney Houston was the embodiment of a dream fulfilled. Born in Newark, New Jersey in 1963, she carried music in her bloodline. Her mother, Cissy Houston, was a gospel powerhouse who trained her daughter's voice not for the spotlight, but for the spirit. Aretha Franklin called Whitney her godchild. Dionne Warwick was her cousin. To anyone watching closely, destiny seemed to hum in the background of her childhood. By the early 1980 seconds, that destiny erupted. Clive Davis discovered her in smoky nightclubs and understood immediately. This wasn't just another singer. Whitney possessed a tone so clear, it cut through any room, soaring octaves without effort, cascading runs like a waterfall. When she released her debut album in 1985, it was as if a new standard had been set for popular music. She didn't just sing songs, she defined them. Saving All My Love for You, Greatest Love of All, How Will I Know? Each track felt larger than life, yet intimate enough to live inside listeners' hearts. The success was dizzying. Grammys, chart records, world tours. By the 1992nd, she wasn't only the princess of pop, she was its queen. Her performance of the Star-Spangled Banner at the 1991 Super Bowl became a cultural landmark, played on radio as if it were a chart-topping single. And when she starred in The Bodyguard, opposite Kevin Costner, she wasn't just a singer anymore, she became a global movie star. The soundtrack sold more than 40 million copies, anchored by her rendition of I Will Always Love You, a ballad that became the anthem of a generation. To the public, Whitney was flawless. Beauty, voice, charisma, she seemed untouchable. Yet even amid the triumphs, she yearned for something more personal, more grounding. Behind the carefully staged photos and choreographed appearances, she wanted what so many stars crave, love that felt real. It was during this time, at the height of her fame, that she encountered Bobby Brown, a performer who came from a very different world. While Whitney was polished, disciplined, and groomed for crossover success, Bobby had emerged from the raw, street-smart energy of New Edition and his own solo career. He was electric on stage, unpredictable off it, and carried an edge that both thrilled and alarmed. To outsiders, they seemed mismatched. She was America's sweetheart. He was the bad boy of R&B. But to Whitney, Bobby represented authenticity, a man who wasn't dazzled by her fame, someone who could break through the carefully managed walls around her, Their chemistry was undeniable. Against the advice of friends and despite raised eyebrows from the industry, she followed her heart. In 1992, the fairy tale became official. Whitney Houston married Bobby Brown. The wedding was lavish, the headlines breathless. Cameras captured the couple smiling, laughing, basking in the glow of new love. Many thought it was the ultimate fusion of two musical dynasties, a pairing that would only amplify their talents. For a moment, it truly felt like the dream was complete. The superstar diva and the streetwise prince united. But love stories are rarely as perfect as they appear in glossy magazines. In the shadows of their union lay a volatility that neither fame nor fortune could contain. The stage was set not just for a romance, but for a storm. The wedding had promised a new beginning, but soon after the vows, cracks began to appear, cracks that would grow into canyons. Whitney Houston and Bobby Brown loved each other fiercely, but their temperaments collided like storm fronts. She was disciplined by years of training. He thrived on spontaneity. She sought stability, he often chased chaos. At first, the tension seemed like the normal turbulence of a passionate marriage. But for those close to them, warning signs were impossible to ignore. Bobby was jealous of Whitney's success, and Whitney, who had been placed on a pedestal her entire life, craved an intimacy that Bobby sometimes mistook for control. Arguments flared quickly, sometimes in private, sometimes spilling into the public eye. There were whispers of late-night confrontations, of hotel rooms filled with shouting, of friends being asked to leave so the couple could hash out battles that never seemed to resolve. Behind closed doors, the passion that once fueled their union often boiled over into volatility. And then there was the darker temptation substances that became both refuge and weapon. At first, it seemed like nothing more than the excess of fame, the parties, the late nights, the need to unwind after grueling tours. But gradually, recreational use blurred into routine, and routine hardened into dependency. Friends and family noticed the change. Whitney, once radiant with energy and focus, began to withdraw, her mood swinging between euphoria and despair. Bobby, already struggling with his own habits, was hardly in a position to pull her back. Instead, they sank together, each enabling the other. The media began to sense the shift. Tabloids captured photographs of the couple in tense moments, Whitney looking away, Bobby scowling. Rumors multiplied, canceled rehearsals, no-shows at industry events, recording sessions cut short. Still, the public clung to the image of the power couple. When they appeared on red carpets, smiling and arm in arm, it was easy to believe that everything was fine. But behind the carefully rehearsed appearances, exhaustion and conflict were taking their toll. By the mid-1,990 seconds, Whitney's once unshakable voice began to waver. On stage, she sometimes struggled to hit notes that had once come effortlessly. Promoters whispered about unreliability. Journalists wrote cautiously of decline. But instead of pulling back, Whitney pushed forward, determined to prove she was still the diva the world adored. It became a vicious cycle. The more she pushed, the more fragile she became, and the more she turned to quick escapes to keep going. Inside their marriage, Bobby's insecurities deepened. He was often portrayed in the press as the lesser half of the duo, the bad influence who clung to Whitney's stardom. Friends say he resented that label, resented living in the shadow of his wife's unparalleled fame. That resentment sometimes exploded in unpredictable ways, jealous accusations, reckless behavior, brushes with the law. Instead of softening the storm, Whitney's love seemed only to intensify it, binding her to a cycle of hope and disappointment. Family members tried to intervene. Cissy Houston, Whitney's mother, voiced her concerns repeatedly, urging her daughter to leave what she saw as a toxic relationship. But Whitney resisted. She believed in her marriage, in her love for Bobby. She insisted that he understood her in ways no one else could, that together they were simply misunderstood. Ride or die became less a slogan than a reality she was willing to weather any storm as long as it meant staying with the man she chose. Yet the storms grew stronger, public spats became tabloid fodder, rumors of police involvement circulated. At the same time, Whitney's music, the very gift that had once lifted her above everything, began to suffer. Albums took longer to complete, performances grew inconsistent. By the late 1,990 seconds, the cracks were no longer possible to hide. The control they once thought they had over their marriage, over their habits, over the narrative of their lives was slipping away. They were no longer simply living a love story. They were spiraling into a cautionary tale, and the world was watching. By the turn of the new millennium, the fairy tale veneer had completely fractured. What had once been whispered in back rooms now played out in front of cameras. Whitney Houston and Bobby Brown were no longer the dazzling power couple. They had become symbols of squandered talent and public scandal. Whitney's career, once unstoppable, began to falter. Concert tours were canceled without explanation. When she did appear on stage, fans noticed her voice, once crystalline and commanding, had grown thinner, shakier, and unpredictable. Journalists who once celebrated her angelic tone now wondered aloud if the greatest voice of her generation was slipping away. In interviews, Whitney looked exhausted, her words sometimes erratic, her laughter unsettlingly forced. The infamous 2002 Diane Sawyer interview crystallized the spiral. Millions of viewers tuned in expecting reassurance that their idol was still in control. Instead, they watched a woman defensive, jittery, and fragile. When asked about substance abuse, her retort, "Crack is whack," became a tabloid headline, reducing a deeply painful struggle into a cruel punchline. The interview that could have redeemed her instead magnified the tragedy unfolding in real time. Meanwhile, Bobby Brown battled his own demons. Arrests for driving under the influence, altercations, and public outbursts painted him as reckless and unstable. Each incident dragged Whitney's name into the headlines. Instead of separating herself from the chaos, she doubled down on her loyalty, often defending him publicly. To her, Bobby wasn't just a husband, he was her partner in the trenches, the only one she believed truly understood the pressures crushing her. But to the outside world, he was the villain dragging her down. Reality television soon turned their dysfunction into spectacle. In 2005, Being Bobby Brown aired, giving viewers unfiltered access to their daily lives. Instead of humanizing them, the show shocked fans with its raw portrayal of erratic behavior, endless arguments, and uncomfortable intimacy. The Whitney Houston millions adored seemed unrecognizable. Critics called it the lowest point of her career. For Whitney, who once commanded the world's largest stages, it was a devastating exposure of just how far she had fallen. Behind the cameras, the spiral deepened. Friends and family described a home filled with constant turmoil, arguments escalating late into the night, financial problems mounting despite enormous earnings, and a steady decline in health for both Whitney and Bobby. Whitney's once radiant presence dimmed as weight loss and exhaustion became impossible to hide. Rumors circulated of interventions, of rehab attempts that ended in relapse, of loved ones begging her to leave Bobby for her own survival. Yet Whitney clung to the relationship. She described Bobby not as her downfall, but as her anchor, a man flawed and difficult, but still the center of her world. This devotion, however, only intensified public criticism. Headlines framed her as America's fallen sweetheart, a tragic example of how love can morph into destruction. The media frenzy was relentless. Every canceled show, every shaky performance, every paparazzi photograph of the couple looking disheveled fed the narrative. Rather than sympathy, the public often responded with mockery or pity. The same tabloids that once crowned her the voice now treated her as a cautionary tale. Still, glimmers of the old Whitney would surface. On rare nights, when the music cut through the haze, her voice could still electrify a room. But those moments grew fewer and further apart. By the early 2010s, her recording output had slowed dramatically. Albums that once topped charts now struggled, overshadowed by scandal rather than celebrated for artistry. What made the spiral so devastating was the memory of what she had been. Fans remembered the woman who had filled stadiums with soaring notes, who had sung of the greatest love of all. To see her unravel in real time was heartbreaking. And to watch Bobby's chaos intertwine with hers made it feel like a shared tragedy, one fueled not just by their choices, but by a system eager to watch stars crash for entertainment. By the time their marriage neared its breaking point, the fallout was complete. The Houston Brown household had become synonymous with dysfunction. Careers were damaged, reputation shredded, and health deteriorating. What began as a passionate love story had devolved into a cycle of pain, addiction, and public humiliation. And yet, for Whitney, leaving Bobby was never simple. Love had blurred into dependency, fame had blurred into isolation, and the spiral was still pulling her under. By the mid-2010s, Whitney Houston was caught between two realities. On the surface, she was still a legend, her name etched in music history, her voice immortalized on recordings that would never fade. But in daily life, she was fighting for survival. The years of chaos, substance abuse, and turbulence with Bobby Brown had left scars too deep to hide. The final unraveling began at home. Their marriage, once fueled by passion, had hardened into exhaustion. Arguments were constant, money troubles grew despite their wealth, and trust had evaporated. Friends who visited described a house filled with tension, where moments of tenderness were quickly drowned out by disputes. Bobby's legal issues mounted, further straining the relationship. For Whitney, the man she had once defended against the world now felt like a chain holding her down. In 2006, she made the decision that once seemed unthinkable. She filed for divorce. The separation was bitter, public, and dissected by tabloids. Custody battles over their daughter, Bobby Christina, played out like another act in a long-running tragedy. For Whitney, it was a chance at liberation, but also a terrifying leap into the unknown. She was stepping away from the man she had clung to for over a decade, a partner who had defined so much of her downfall and yet remained entwined with her identity. The world hoped for a comeback, and for a time, it seemed possible. In 2009, Whitney released I Look to You, her first studio album in 7 years. The record debuted at #1 on the Billboard charts. Her voice was huskier, weathered, but still carried the power of her spirit. Fans cheered. Critics cautiously celebrated a return, and it felt like maybe, just maybe, the diva had reclaimed her crown. But the triumph was fragile. Touring proved difficult. Performances were uneven, sometimes painful to watch. On certain nights, the old brilliance flickered. On others, she struggled to finish songs. Whispers grew louder. Had the years of abuse, both emotional and physical, both self-inflicted and inflicted by the man she once loved, taken away her gift forever? Offstage, Whitney was still battling demons. Rehab visits continued. Interviews revealed both determination and fatigue. She spoke of faith, of lessons learned, of looking forward, but her eyes betrayed the weariness of someone who had carried too much for too long. Then came February 2012, Los Angeles, the weekend of the Grammy Awards. Whitney was in town, preparing for industry parties, reconnecting with old friends, and according to many, trying to pull herself back into the spotlight one more time. But behind the hotel doors, her struggles had not vanished. On the 11th of February, the news broke. Whitney Houston had been found unresponsive in her hotel bathroom. Despite efforts to revive her, she was pronounced gone. She was just 48 years old. The shock was seismic. Fans flooded streets with her music. Radio stations played her hits non-stop, and tributes poured in from every corner of the world. At the Grammys the very next night, Jennifer Hudson stood trembling as she sang I Will Always Love You, the song that had defined Whitney's glory and now symbolized her farewell. For many, her death was not just the end of a superstar's life, but the inevitable conclusion of years spent spiraling toward tragedy. The breaking point had been reached not in a single moment, but in a series of choices, pressures, and a love story that had once promised salvation but instead delivered destruction. Whitney Houston's fall was not hers alone. It was a mirror of the industry's cruelty, the media's appetite for scandal, and the devastating power of a toxic relationship. She had given the world her voice, her soul, her brilliance, and in return, she was left fragile, broken, and finally silenced. When Whitney Houston's voice was silenced in February 2012, the world didn't just lose a superstar, it lost a cultural landmark. Her songs have been woven into weddings, graduations, national ceremonies, and private heartbreaks. To this day, it is nearly impossible to hear the opening notes of I Will Always Love You without feeling the ache of what was lost. Her funeral, broadcast worldwide, was both a celebration and a reckoning. Friends like Clive Davis and Kevin Costner spoke of her brilliance, of a voice that seemed to come from another world. Family members remembered not just the diva, but the daughter, the cousin, the mother. And when gospel choirs filled the church with soaring harmonies, it felt as though Whitney's own sound was still present, transcendent, eternal. Yet, alongside the music, the questions lingered. How could a woman so gifted, so cherished, be consumed by such pain? How did love something that should have nourished become the very force that eroded her strength? The answer, perhaps, lies in the contradiction she embodied. A perfectionist trapped by impossible standards, a public idol longing for private peace, a woman whose loyalty bound her to a man who could not steady her. Her story became a cautionary tale about fame, addiction, and toxic love, but it also ignited conversations that had too often been ignored. People began to talk more openly about substance abuse, about the toll of celebrity pressure, about how destructive relationships can devastate even the strongest among us. In the years since, Whitney's life and death have been revisited in documentaries, films, and books, not to sensationalize, but to understand. And then there is her music, the true legacy she left behind. Every new generation discovers her catalog and marvels. How could one voice hold so much power, tenderness, and vulnerability all at once? Artists from Beyoncé to Ariana Grande cite Whitney as a guiding light, the standard against which all singers are measured. For her daughter, Bobby Christina, the story became even more heartbreaking, as she too struggled in the aftermath of losing her mother. But even that tragedy underscores the larger truth. Whitney Houston's life was not only her own, it rippled outward, shaping family, fans, and an industry. In the end, Whitney remains both legend and lesson, a reminder of music's ability to lift us higher than we thought possible, and of the dangers that can follow when the person behind the legend is left unprotected. Her voice endures, her story warrants, and her memory, complicated and beautiful, continues to echo long after the final note.